Can't tell if that's an otter or a beaver, but he's alive. Well, good morning. This is the very last section of chapter 5 called Out of Control. Parents not only serve as guides, mentors, and examples for their growing children, they also serve as protective boundaries, safety nets that ensure that when a child experiments, he or she will not fall too hard or reach too far. In the absence of a parental guide, some children find themselves running wild. They do not know how to control their own impulses or how to moderate their behavior. At first, the lack of a parental boundary feels like exhilarating freedom. For most, however, it quickly becomes overwhelming, and the child feels as if there is no wall to contain his or her self. Keith was 12 when his father died, and he remembers getting little, if any, advice from his father during the few years they did spend together. Keith's mother and father were well into their 40s when they adopted him. He was their only child. He recalls them as being conscientious, absentee landlords, there to make sure he was clothed and fed, but not there for much else. Keith believes that when his father died, his mother went to work and he went wild. When Keith was 15, he ran away from home. He remembers standing at the side of the road for most of the night, trying to hitchhike a ride. After several hours and no ride, he returned home, physically exhausted but undaunted. His hard-working mother never knew that he had crawled out the bedroom window and had been on his way to the big city. As an adolescent, Keith drank, stole cars, was truant from school, and eventually was expelled from high school. All he wanted was adventure, and there was no one to stop him from experimenting with everything. Just before his 16th birthday, he was arrested for driving with a false driver's license and also charged with driving while intoxicated. Keith realized that his own impulses were out of control, and he was wise enough to know that if he did not find some way to contain himself, he would quickly land in reform school. The austere reform school that sat on the hill at the end of his town served as a reminder for Keith of what happened to boys who could not control themselves. To his credit, Keith decided to join the army. From the posters he saw in the town hall, Keith knew that the army turned boys into men, and he was quite sure that he needed some assistance in the task of becoming a man. Once in the service, Keith realized that discipline in the army was different from discipline in the real world. There were consequences for bad behavior, and one could find one's freedom taken away for a very long time if one did not obey the rules. Keith became a good soldier and also completed his high school education while in the service. He managed to get into an occasional fight, but never to do anything else that pushed the boundaries of acceptable behavior. The military served as a viable container for Keith, a container that was absent when his father died. Once out of the military, Keith found his impulses out of control again. This time, his wild behavior was not antisocial and violent. It was sexual. Every young woman was a potential conquest, and Keith found himself having many concurrent sexual relationships. One morning, he woke up to find a young woman in his bed, a woman he did not know and did not recognize. When they both roused themselves, she explained that they had met at a bar the night before, and both gotten so drunk that they could barely walk, and that she had come home with him and that they had had intercourse. This encounter seemed not only ridiculous to Keith, but also somewhat embarrassing. He knew once again that he could not control his impulses on his own and sought an external boundary in order to contain himself. This time he decided to get married. He had been dating a young woman who was interested in marrying him, and shortly after his anonymous escapade, he proposed, and the two went to a justice of the peace and were married. Just as the army contained his adolescence acting out, marriage served the same purpose in young adulthood. Keith became a responsible husband and remained faithful to his wife. The social conventions of marriage were sufficient to control Keith's behavior. In the absence of a parent to provide social restraint and containment, Keith sought containment via external social institutions, the military, and matrimony. In each case, he managed to control himself successfully. Wow, that's beautiful. College, the usual training ground for young adults, often seems too unstructured for young men and women who feel out of control when faced with the task of creating the self. College encourages intellectual, social, and personal experimentation. While a young man or woman may initially relish that experimentation, the freedom that accompanies it quickly feels overwhelming to some. Young women in particular, who felt that their college-aged sexual acting out might well result in an unwanted pregnancy, felt much safer when they left college for the structure of a job. Several women I interviewed felt that they were able to settle down in the 9-to-5 routine of employment in a way that they had been unable to manage in the freer environment of a university. One woman who had followed the social rules and been a very good girl after her mother's death remembers going berserk in college. I did not know what to do with the freedom. After 3 semesters, I figured I better leave her. It was going to be the end of me. Another woman sought containment in a relationship with a very stoical and emotionless man. Her boyfriend seemed so calm and undaunted by her ups and downs that she felt safe with him. In many ways, he performed the functions of a stable parent. Parents tried to remain undaunted by their children's adolescent adventures. A good parent knows when to say no, but a good parent also knows not to overreact to what is normal testing and experimentation. This woman found a boyfriend who served as a safe buffer for her own out-of-control behavior. His ability not to panic when she felt as if she was losing herself allowed her to feel more contained and eventually more able to control herself. Certainly, there is a number of people who never manage to contain their own impulses and to find a way to gain the containment that they need in order to grow beyond adolescent acting out. These individuals, none of whom were interviewed for this book, find their way into jails into homeless shelters, and at times to an early death on the streets. Despite some severe and often dangerous acting out, each of the individuals with whom I spoke was able eventually to find containment and control in societal institutions such as work, marriage, and the military, institutions designed not only to accomplish a task, but also to ensure social order. The task of creating the self is never an easy one. Children who struggle into adulthood with two stable and secure parents still struggle with the questions and pressures of how to become a person. When some of the support and guidance that might be provided by a parent is removed, the task of creating the self becomes more complicated and more difficult. Most of the people with whom I spoke felt that they would not have chosen to go it alone. If they had been given a choice, they would have selected to grow up with the parent, the support, and encouragement of two loving parents. Yet many likened their experience to the child who is taught to swim by being thrown into the lake. One has no choice. If you want to survive, you learn to swim. And that has been the end of chapter 5, the chapter called Creating the Self, from the book The Loss That Is Forever. Chapter 6 is titled Building Relationships, the Dance of Love and Loss. Thank you for spending some time with me this morning. I appreciate you. I'm just now seeing that group of birds is flying in. I cannot tell what you can see from this video. But that is a flock of birds.